Hi everyone, and welcome to this channel, I guess. I'm not entirely sure where I'm going with this or what the end goal is, but essentially I've recently been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, or BPD, and I've noticed that it's not a disorder that's commonly talked about, and as a result, there's a lot of stigma and misconceptions surrounding BPD, and I wanted to start this channel as a way for me to talk about my own mental health and attempt to destigmatize these lesser-known mental illnesses by not only providing information, but also talking about some of my own experiences, because I always find that, it's one thing to read about an experience or condition, but that doesn't always fully encapsulate what it's like for people who actually live with these disorders. And I've always admired creators like Anna Akana and Multiplicity in Me for centering their channels around mental health. And I love watching a lot of animation channels like Illymation and Emily Artful. And I love how they use art to tell their stories. So I guess this is kind of a combination of these. So this video is going to serve as kind of an introduction to borderline personality disorder and I guess personality disorders in general. And just a note, I will be going off of the current DSM-5 criteria for a lot of these because that's what's generally accepted and used. But there are definitely still problems with the DSM and with how we diagnose mental illnesses as a whole. And I may make another video on that because it's a really complicated subject and a lot of people have debates over what the best approach is. Okay, to start, what is a personality disorder? The DSM defines these as enduring patterns of inner experiences and behaviors that deviate from the cultural norm, and this can be in cognition, affectivity, interpersonal functioning, impulse control, really anything, and these patterns are inflexible and enduring, and they can cause significant impairment or distress in the people who have them. But these disorders are also often egosyntonic, which means someone with a personality disorder may not even be aware of the impairment that it causes. With a lot of these, people who are later diagnosed with a personality disorder are only diagnosed and they only seek help because the people around them notice something wrong, instead of them saying to themselves that, oh, their behavior or their personality, there's something kind of not normal, like different from the cultural norm as the DSM uses, but that's also not like the best definition because what really defines normality. But yeah, that's beside the point for this video. So personality disorders are categorized into clusters based on descriptive similarities, but these aren't fixed, nor are they diagnostically significant. So these clusters are there to help organize these disorders based on similar traits and patterns of thinking, but they're not like hard, fast diagnoses, nor are they strict categories, as there tends to be a lot of overlap between multiple types. And a lot of these disorders are also comorbid with each other, which means there's a high probability that if you have one, you may also have another. They kind of occur together. So these clusters, and you should imagine like loose like air quotes around some of these descriptors, are as follows. Cluster A, the eccentric or odd, which includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Cluster B, the erratic and dramatic, which includes antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. And cluster C, fearful or anxious, which includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive, not to be confused with OCD, personality disorders. Now, these descriptors are, again, pretty loose and quite subjective, and there are disorders that can fall into multiple of these categories. And of course, I can't really speak too much on the other personality disorders because that's not my experience, but I can talk about borderline. So, the core of BPD is emotional dysregulation, which results in intense emotional reactions as well as difficulty recovering from these intense reactions. And this can manifest in extreme, impulsive, self-destructive, or risky behaviors and maladaptive and unhealthy coping mechanisms in an attempt to cope with or avoid these strong emotions. People with BPD also exhibit an intense fear of rejection and abandonment, and may even imagine or perceive abandonment when none exists. For example, when a friend doesn't respond to one of my texts, my first thought isn't, oh, they're busy, they didn't see it, they meant to respond but just didn't get around to it because they have a lot going on, or really any other rational explanation. Instead, my brain instantly freaks out and it goes, this person hates you, this person has secretly always hated you, they're abandoning you, they're ignoring you, they don't ever want to speak to you ever again, they are leaving you, they are abandoning you in your time of need, and they are not speaking to you, which is kind of a common anxiety in people from what I know, but a person with BPD may have an inability to deal with that sudden emotional reaction, and they may turn to some intense behaviors, such as turning to substances, making risky decisions, or even lashing out at the person they believe is abandoning them, kind of ending the relationship or lashing out at them before the other party gets a chance to abandon them. So it's like, I'm gonna reject you before you have the chance to abandon me, as kind of like a defense mechanism. And this is maybe an extreme example, and not all people with BPD will react in the same way to things, but the emotional dysregulation is there. The inability to properly deal with a lot of emotional responses because they are felt so strongly. People with BPD may be described as hypersensitive, and renowned psychologist Marsha Linehan, who herself has BPD and developed dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, which is the most common and the most effective treatment for BPD, likens borderlines to emotional burn victims, lacking emotional skin and overly sensitive to emotions, the same way someone with burns on their physical skin may be overly sensitive to physical sensations. Another way to think about it is kind of like everyone is a gas tank of like how much they can take in on a given day. On a good day, someone wakes up at 0%, and throughout the day they may fill up to like 75 or 100, depending on like how good their day is, On a bad day, someone might start out at 80%, and a lot of small things can add up really quickly and make them kind of shut down or explode. And people with BPD tend to start out every day pretty full already. We have a lower capacity for emotions because we feel these emotions a lot more intensely than non-borderlines. So here, BPD seems to deviate slightly from its cluster B descriptors of erratic and dramatic, as emotional dysregulation can come from an intense fear and anxiety, that intense fear of abandonment that BPD usually exhibits. So this can kind of make the disorder seem more like a cluster C descriptor. So again, these clusters are very like loose descriptors. They're very subjective. It's just another example of how diagnosis is kind of a flawed science, but yeah, that's also beside the point. So now let's talk about what causes BPD. I mentioned Marsha Linehan earlier as a renowned BPD psychologist, and she's usually known as like the BPD expert, like she is the person. And she outlines the biopsychosocial model for BPD. And as the name suggests, it combines the biological, the psychological, and the social. So a biological predisposition, so genetics, a pre-existing biological vulnerability to emotional dysregulation, combined with an invalidating social environment, leads to this psychology of emotional dysregulation. Most people with BPD grow up in an invalidating environment or a high-risk transaction environment. To kind of visualize this, think of a crying infant in their crib with their caretakers kind of around them in the house, in a normal, validating environment, the caretakers would be attentive to the infant's needs and will respond appropriately to the crying. But an invalidating household may ignore the infant or even insult and punish the infant for their emotional outbursts. This causes this mismatch between a child's needs and the caregiver's response or emotionality, and that leads to the inability to properly regulate emotions internally. And so this child begins to rely on external reactions instead of their own internal emotional regulation, which then can lead to BPD. And many people with BPD suffered some sort of trauma in early childhood. 75% are survivors of childhood sexual assault. So BPD is an incredibly complicated disorder, as are all personality disorders, and can be very difficult to treat. Personality disorders are notoriously difficult to treat as a whole because someone's personality encompasses all spheres of their being, from social to cognitive to executive, and your personality, that's like all of you. So it's very hard to kind of cure, quote unquote, cure your personality. And these disorders, because they're also egosyntonic, as mentioned earlier, people with these disorders may not even know that they have them. Another issue is that a lot of these personality disorders can cause social isolation. For example, with BPD, people's relationships tend to be very intense and volatile, maybe short-lived, a lot of maybe negative relationships. And so, these emotional responses that the borderline may exhibit, or the unhealthy relationships that they find themselves in as a result, can cause social isolation. And so without like a good social network, it's hard to really get help or get support for your disorder. Overall, personality disorders are faced with a lot of misinformation and high stigma, as a lot of them are not well studied, and others are stereotyped as dangerous or crazy because people don't understand them, like how antisocial personality disorder, for example, is often conflated with psychopathy or cruelty, when that's not actually the case. Personality disorders and their manifestations often come from a place of trauma or deep fear, and while I don't believe in using your mental illness to excuse your behavior or the harm it causes, it is also important to note why you or someone with a personality disorder may act the way they do, and to have compassion and know what the triggers are and know how to help yourself or someone through them. I myself struggled a lot to come to terms with my diagnosis because of the amount of stigma and misinformation surrounding BPD and other personality disorders. And I'm hoping that I can use this channel to help end that stigma and encourage people to educate themselves on BPD and other often forgotten or stigmatized mental disorders, to help themselves or better understand their loved ones who may struggle with similar mental illnesses. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you enjoy this painting that I have, this digital work. It was done in the software Krita, Krita, which is a free drawing program if anyone is curious. And I hope that you enjoyed just this video overall. And if you have any suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I would love to hear from people, regardless of whether or not you have a personality disorder. Just would love to hear thoughts. All right, thank you.